Hello and welcome to the LNUR Line podcast for LEGO train fans. This is episode 4 and we're going to be talking about scaling LEGO model locomotives and wagons soon. So with us on today's podcast we have Andrew Harvey of LNUR.
Hello, this is my actual voice, not the one Chris gave last week.
Damn it! Damn it!
We have Ben McGuinness.
Hello.
We have Chris Miller.
Hello there.
Isaac Smith.
Isaac.
Hello,
Corner.
Isaac.
Matt Corner.
How do?
Matt Dawson, who is our producer as usual.
Hello.
William Elliott.
Hello.
And our token American, Trace Pierce.
Howdy, gang.
Excellent. Okay. We usually kick off with a little bit of news from the LEGO world and the LEGO train world. So I'm going to pass over to Matt Dawson to speak about a couple of bits of news for us.
Thanks, Richard. There's actually quite a lot to talk about since our last podcast. The first piece of news is that OK Brickworks, along with Brick Train Depot, has announced the R68 3D printed turnout. Now this is a bit of a strange one in terms of the geometry of LEGO because it's not fitting in within the 16 stud standard spacing, but it is a good middle ground between the R40 turnouts which LEGO produce and some aftermarket producers and the R104s. So this is obviously a bit different. It's quite good for, say, yard ladders or for cross areas, and it's also quite useful for people who want something bigger than an R40 but without going to an R104. The next piece of news is that Tram Prices has announced they're now releasing injection moulded half-length straights. From what the discussion has been within LNUR, these have been a little bit on the expensive side, but then again, this is the first bout of injection moulding Tram Prices has done, and obviously I think once they've had a good use out of the mould it will start to get a little cheaper, or they might possibly be able to use that excess money for getting the mould done to possibly do something else, such as the quarter length, for example. Brick Model Railroader has got two major pieces of news. The first one being the new release of 3 sets of premium instructions. These are for the R30-9 and R40-9 reefer, and that's actually in one set. The Gunderson 6-foot high cube boxcar and the American Car and Foundry Centerton covered hopper. The covered hopper and the reefer instructions are actually on their way to me as we speak, and they'll be gracing an LNUR layout at some point in the future. The other piece of news from Brick Model Railroader is knuckle couplers. These actually come in 4 types, and there's actually 2 different varieties to choose from. They all have a integration with LEGO that's quite seamless. So 2 of the types actually have a 2x2 footprint, which is actually 2 plates high, and you can get those in a standard or a cranked version, so it actually the coupler is actually slightly above what you'd normally have. And then the other one is actually what would be in LEGO terms would be a 2x2 plate underneath a 2x4 tile. That actually gives you quite a lot of flexibility for models where you actually extend it from, say, a bogie and it actually rubs against the underside of the wagon frame. So obviously quite a lot of American releases do that. And it just adds a bit more flexibility. And again, that's available in a standard and cranked version of the coupler. There's no prices available for these yet, but the estimated release is towards the end of this year, so possibly around October, November sort of time. So it might be that Brick Model Railroader's Trainber contest will have these as a bit of a prize. And obviously the latest released from LEGO, the Crocodile locomotive, was released on the 1st of July. Obviously this is more of just a general, it's been released rather than anything else, and obviously we'll go into more detail into it in a later podcast.
Okay, thanks Matt. We've also got the Brick Train Awards still going on, and those entries close on the 10th of July, so you can still enter for free via bricktrainawards.com until the Friday the 10th of July. And the winners are going to be announced on the 17th of July, which is the Friday after that. So there'll be a video up on the LNUR page and the Brick Train Awards page and also the BMR Facebook page as well. And that is about it for news. So we're going to pass over to Will to discuss some recently discovered. Anyway, they might have been there a while. Recently discovered Lego Ideas projects involving trains. So over to Will.
Yeah, some of these have been out a while, and some of them actually might be reasonably well known, but just pushing them over that line. So, in alphabetical order, we start off with the Berlin pre-war S-Bahn train. Now, this is a 2-car unit. According to the creator, they worked in 2-car units, but only in the yard, which sounds like nonsense to me, but I think it's basically standard Lego talk of you can't do a 4 unit because half of it would be the same as the other half. Anyway, so it's a 2-car pre-war multiple unit. It's hard to tell what it's powered by, but it looks very smart indeed. It's 10 wide, got quite a bit of detail, and especially the interior detail, which is very, very smart, and not just because he keeps using chrome everywhere. The set's operated from the late 30s till 2003, so from a point of view of a Lego fan who might want to modify it, there's a lot of scope for playing around with the design once it's been released, which would certainly endear me into buying a couple of sets. And currently has 129 supporters with 415 days left. The next one, this guy's done several sets, but this is the one I think would be have the most appeal, and is titled Classic Steam Mixed Traffic Set. It is a full train set comprising of a pannier tank, a Western Region coach. It's hard to tell if it's meant to be a Mark 1 or a Great Western coach. 3 trucks, brake van, small stationer car, and an oval of track. Apart from the Loco, which personally I think could be better, but isn't bad, it is really well designed. There's a lot of attention to detail gone into this.
It is nice.
Yeah, but he's still used standard Lego train parts for the most part, which means, unlike anything that I would ever input there, it could actually be produced. The only minor issue is he's used old-fashioned windows for the coach doors, which might cause a problem. But I mean, this set to me is like, that would be my holy grail. It's like somebody comes along and says, I would like to start doing more AFOL style railways. Where do I start? And this set exists. I'd be like, buy the Classic Steam set. It's got everything you want. It shows you a lot of techniques that you would use as a Lego railway builder. And as a weird coincidence, I'm pretty certain it's designed by a guy I used to watch on YouTube who does fantastic stop motion animation with Transformers and plasticine as well. He's a really canny guy, so for that reason alone, I'd like to see it made. Currently has 247 supporters and 349 days. Definitely support this. Also, he's got a express passenger set and a freight set. Different locos, probably using the same coaches and trucks. I haven't checked. Support those as well, because if one of his sets gets built, that would be amazing for me. Next,
it reminds me of a like a Hornby set.
It's very obviously inspired by Hornby's beginner sets. The only downside is I don't think it's in any way, shape, or form powered, but I'm not sure I'd care because it's such a nice set, and I'd love to see that exist as a Lego set. Next one is titled Fleet of Vintage Trams. Personally, I think this would make 4 smaller sets rather than one big set. I don't know how many people want 4 vintage trams. They're all very nice builds. I'm just not sure what 4 very different trams from 4 very different cities, what appeal that would hold to people who aren't massive tram fans, but each of them is very good, and I would really like to own at least one of them. The set consists of a double-decker from Leeds, which is yellow, white, and brown. A double-decker from Sheffield, which is the tan and brown, dark brown one. An open-top single-decker from Blackpool, which is an odd choice for a Blackpool one, because there's so many more iconic ones, but it is nice. And that is red, white, and tan. And a open-topped double-decker from London, which is dark blue and white. I say, as somebody who routinely visits Beamish and sees trams like this at least once a year, I would love to have at least one of these. All 4, not so sure. That currently has 226 supporters and 359 days left. Next one
Can I just jump in here before you do the next one?
Uh-huh.
On the info about it, it mentions the Crouch Tramway Museum, and I have rode all of these trams.
You harlot.
I asked permission first. I would quite like this set.
The thing is, a set like this is going to be quite expensive.
Oh, it's going to be £300 plus. I'd have thought.
Yeah, and it's like, as somebody who is slowly coming around to the price of the crocodile set, because I felt that was a bit expensive for an unpowered Loco.
Yeah.
4 unpowered trams, it's not going to be cheap, and the problem is LEGO are going to struggle to sell that. Whereas 1 or 2 trams, I mean, like, I'd probably go for either the London and the Blackpool or the Sheffield and the Blackpool, because those are. Sorry?
Would there be an opportunity to maybe split it up where it's almost a series? All the trams are released separately?
That could be a good idea. I mean, if it works for those ridiculous dot pictures, which are charging 115 quid for, it'd work for the trams.
Just to give you some nerdy tram news, the Sheffield tram is the last working tram before they brought back trams in the current way.
What about Blackpool, which never closed?
Well,
The last of the proper, not a novelty.
Blackpool has proper trams too. They have modern ones as well,
They're a
don't they?
novelty. It's the
So what you're
last,
saying is, because Blackpool equal novelty.
it has something along the lines of the last tram. Perhaps they meant the last.
Probably meant the last Sheffield tram, yeah. Right. So the next one, I suspect a lot of the people in the podcast will already come across, and it is actually quite well supported, but it's not close to the 10,000 yet. And that is
Mallard.
nearly. That is the Flying Scotsman. Now, anybody who's been on any of the forums and possibly some of the LEGO train groups will have seen this being advertised, because the guy's not shy about it. But it's a pretty nice, heavy rebuild of Emerald Knight as an actual A3. Modelled very clearly after Flying Scotsman in its preservation LNER green with German smoke deflectors state. It still has the exact same problem that Emerald Knight has with the tender, of the tender is too narrow, and I suspect nobody will ever fix that because they know how much it annoys me. But it is a very smart representation of an A3, and I suspect, unlike my own attempt at an A3, would actually be buildable by somebody who hasn't got more time, money, than they have sense. So I also has the advantage that we know the chassis kind of already works, although hopefully he's fixed the cylinder issue. This currently has 2,720 supporters and has 97 days left. And finally, we have a set from somebody I've been following on Flickr for a while, and I believe is on several of the train groups as well. The London Underground train set. This is 6 or 7 wide, I think. 7 wide, London Underground, and it's just really smart and just really captures the look of the London Underground. I believe it's also motorized, which is nice. Yeah, this guy's been producing a lot of really great underground designs, and I'd love to see one of them for sale, and would definitely pick one up myself. The specific stock here is 1973, but because a lot of underground looks very similar, it wouldn't take much to transform that into your favourite underground, if anybody other than Miller has a favourite underground. This currently has 337 supporters and has 359 days left to go.
While I encourage underground trains, 7 wide for underground is just silly.
I do
All those
quite
in
like.
favour.
I would agree, but it does look good.
Oh, it looks good, but it's too wide.
Oh, it
What
does
would you
look good.
prefer?
It looks like it's got about the right profile. I think.
Well, some of us don't like to just steal Isaac's discarded ideas that found underneath the dustbin.
At least mine's motorized. Oh,
Is it though? Because at least Isaac's was the same height from front to back.
Put it on stilts, though, didn't you?
how else are they going to clean the roof of the tunnels?
What, by literally scraping the roof of the train on it? I
Oh,
don't think
God.
that'll have,
Exactly.
that will not have the desired effect.
Not if you sat on the roof.
Yeah, but everybody ever knew, wouldn't they?
So our main topic this podcast is scaling LEGO locomotives and rolling stock, and I'm going to pass over to Andrew Harvey, who has a bit of an introductory explanation for us.
So we're going to have a bit of a discussion about scaling of locos. So basically, when someone wants to make a Lego train, they need to know how big it's going to be, what scale we're going to make it at. And if you've been listening, you might have heard us say things like 6 wide, 7 wide, 8 wide, and you might not have a clue what we're going on about. So we're going to try and clarify what that means, and also just generally talk about the different scales that people can work at and how they come to them. So you might think that you look at the size of the Lego track and you think, well, that tells us what size to make straight away. But unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. Particularly the official Lego sets that you can get of trains, they might not be the sort of correct size or accurate to the track. And then depending on where you are in the world, trains aren't the same size either, so that makes it a bit more complicated as well. So for the most part, we're going to be talking about just using the standard Lego track, although there are some people out there who have made track at odd sizes, like really massive models of trains that aren't really designed to run at all. And there's also some guys who have made some narrow gauge stuff that use much narrower track. But for the most part, you've got the standard Lego track, and the good thing is the tracks stay the same size right through the range of Lego trains, going back all the way to the 4.5 era, 12 volts, 9 volts, all the way to the sort of modern day plastic track for power functions, powered up, etc. It's all the same scale of track. If you think about this like conventional model trains, unfortunately it doesn't really correlate to any of them. It's kind of halfway between O gauge and gauge 1. So you can't use it with any other like conventional model train stuff. One slight perk of it though is when you look at standard gauge track in the real world, it's you've got a gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches. That's kind of what most people use. And when you look at the size of your Lego, like the studs in between the rails, it pretty much works out at 1 stud per foot. So if you're trying to do it at the correct size, that's quite handy to use. A stud's about 8 millimeters, so you're looking at 8 millimeters to the foot as your accurate scale. But not everyone really uses that because sometimes that's not convenient or not what people prefer. In terms of talking about things like 6 wide, 7 wide, 8 wide, people are talking about basically the width of their models measured using the standard Lego studs, which is the distance between like 2 pips on a Lego brick. And when they talk about, say, 6 wide, they mean that generally the main body or the maximum size of it is 6 studs wide. So it's fairly simple that way. For things like steam locos, you might call it 6 wide if, say, the cab or the tender is 6 studs wide, or like your running boards. And that applies to going up in the larger scales as well. So different people prefer to build at different sizes. Generally, building at the smaller scales, like 6 wide, has its advantages because the trains are smaller. You need less parts. The trains are lighter. They're a bit simpler, just generally a bit less faff involved in making them. As you get to the larger scales, like 7 wide and 8 wide, you can put in maybe a bit more detail. They're a bit more accurate to the real trains, but they are generally quite heavy, which sometimes makes it harder for them to run. If they're wider, they also need to be longer, so that makes it harder to get around the tight Lego curves. That's pretty much roundabout, I think. So, what do you guys think?
I agree.
So we have a couple of speakers to probably introduce it in a vague order of ascending size, and then we can open it up to a more general discussion, I think. So first of all, we've got Microscale, and we have Kaz, aka Blockhead UK, to talk us through that. So Kaz, would you like to introduce what Microscale is and what you can achieve sort of train building wise from that?
Well, thanks for that, Richard. Yes, Microscale. Now that covers a multitude of sins. Anything kind of going from about 1 brick plus 1 plate for the size of a floor, down to 1 brick, 1 plate and another plate on top to layer the floors. As far as trains are concerned, I've built a couple of tiny trains which amount to things that are about 4 plates high. So I start with the base, which is 1 plate, which sits on top of the rail, which generally is the 1x2 grill piece. Although where you actually want your train to sit, you put proper plates under there rather than the grills. Otherwise, they won't stick. And then we've got another layer of plates with perhaps a little stripe going down the side, a cheese wedge on top of that, and some tiles on top, and sometimes a 1x1 clip to represent the power pickups. Obviously, I can send some photos through of what I'm talking about there, but I built some trains that are currently that sort of size, which are on display in the Lego house right now, and also similarly a kind of similar scale stuff of trams that go along the streets of my Micropolis city.
Great. Thanks, Kaz. That was nicely covered. There's also 4 wide trains and the LEGO monorail system, which is really popular with AFOLs, is one of those. So Kaz can talk us through that as well, I think.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, the 3 monorail sets that came from official sets, I've never been very keen on, particularly the red train, although I really love the system and the way that they fit together and the way they work. So when I built my Lego city called Blockville, minifig scale rather than microscale, I decided that I was going to build a custom 4 wide monorail train, and basically got to some chassis and the motor from the old sets and started building with various bits of bricks. My colour scheme I really liked is the one from the Horizon Express, so I decided to make my monorail train have the same colours as that. So we start with a black stripe at the bottom, and then a very thin 1 plate high stripe of white, some nice smoky glass windows, trans black windows, and then a stripe of black at the top, and then orange roof. So my original version of my city had really tight loading gauge, particularly around the back of some modulars. So I decided that I couldn't make it not a lot wider than 4 studs, which was the width of the original train. However, I needed to put a new power functions type battery box in, and I wanted to have it to be remote control with the IR sensor as well. And in the end, my solution was to go and buy a replacement battery box cover for the AAA battery box from, I think it was 4D Bricks. They 3D print the dark bluish grey bottom half of the battery box. And it's got studs on the side, which is marvellous. So basically, my train is 4 studs wide plus vertical tiles mounted on each side to cover that part of the battery box that would otherwise be open to the elements. And I think it works quite well. There's a little bit of a thicker stripe down at the bottom, but I'm quite pleased with it generally and happy with the way it's worked out.
Excellent. Thanks, Kaz. We'll move on to a slightly larger scale. So we're going to move on to 6 wide, and we have Isaac Smith, aka Smith Movies, on YouTube to talk us through some of that.
Hello. Yes, so 6 wide is, I think it was made popular obviously by LEGO themselves. They probably use it mostly as a way of keeping costs down for most of their sets, with the exception being the recent crocodile set that they actually did. The reason that you might want to go for 6 wide primarily is the costs. The average 6 wide Loco can, if you're going straight from scratch and buying parts out of the bat on Bricklink or through a Lego's official website, you can keep costs down to under 50, depending on what you've got, maybe even 80 quid. It depends, but the key to doing things like 6 wide is, like Andrew mentioned earlier, you do lose some of the potential for detail. So you're not doing. You may get 8-wide locomotives that have details on the running plate, small little additions to the coupling rods, or if it's a steam engine, or the railings along the side of the boiler. Things like that, when you are building in 6-wide, can often look a little bit of they can look a little bit out of proportion. So the key is to make sure that you get the proportions of the locomotive or the train that you're looking at right. So instead of focusing on smaller things, you focus on the overall shape and look of the locomotive, key elements. For example, if you're looking at an A4 Pacific, you want to make sure that the valances, the swooping curve over the driving wheels, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-on curve the whole way through. As long as it looks neat and consistent, you may be able to pull it off. And to find things around that, it's a challenge, but it's actually quite a fun challenge. And you can find really interesting ways of getting a good-looking model without going into super detail if you feel like you need to keep your costs down.
Okay, thanks, Isaac. Next up, we've got 7-wide, and Andrew Harvey's going to cover this for us again, although we do have quite a few builders in 7-wide, including Will and Jack, who's going to talk us through one of his wagons later. So, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, so I started out with the official sets, which are generally all 6-wide. But then as I started looking at making steam locos in particular, you start putting things like the connecting rods on the outside of the wheels. And because they stick out a bit more, I started thinking about making my locos at a slightly larger scale than the 6-wide. You might think that it's a logical step to go from 6-wide to 8-wide. The reason I didn't quite go that big, a couple of reasons. One is if you make an 8-wide train or loco and put it next to a 6-wide one, it kind of looks ridiculously too big, and they don't really go together. Whereas if you only go to 7-wide, they're kind of compatible. They don't look too bad next to each other. And then the other reason I didn't go to 8-wide is I started to exhibit my trains at shows by that point, and guys who are building the layouts, and they're putting their platforms and things right next to the track. So if you had an 8-wide body, it would be like scraping along the sides of the platforms and bridges. So at that point, I basically went with 7-wide as a bit of a compromise. So most of my steam locos I build nowadays are that scale.
I think for me, 7-wide's quite a nice compromise because you can get a bit more detail in than 6-wide, but 8-wide still look a little bit massive to me on the tracks. I'm sure they'd be reasonably in scale for some locos. Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Did you want to bring in Will and Jack? Do you have anything to add at the moment, Will and or Jack, or do you just want to wait until the general discussion opens?
And the main thing I would say about 7-wide is it's actually probably the most expensive quote-unquote scale you can work on because it relies heavily on 3-stud long plates and bricks and whatnot, which tend not to be quite as common as anything with an even number of studs on it. I think most of the UK's 3x3 plates have ended up in my ownership throughout the years since they came out, and I can't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah, and that's another point about 7-wide, which I think Jack mentioned before, is when you're building 7-wide, you basically live off jumper plates. You tend to buy jumper plates by the sack to feed your 7-wide needs.
Oh, Christ, yes. Also, slight correction to what Andrew said in the introduction. I would actually say 7-wide is pretty close to bang on the same as O-gauge. Having posed me A3 next to an O-gauge A3 and been pleasantly surprised how similar they were in shape and size.
Yeah, I think in terms of scale, 7-wide is about O-gauge. I think I was talking more about the actual track gauge.
I have a feeling the track is actually very slightly narrower of an O-gauge track.
O-gauge is 32 mil and Lego is about 38 mil.
Is that much different? Yeah, fair enough. So, certainly, my aim is in the long run to steer away from 7 wide and start going purely on O gauge measurements in the Lego setting.
Yeah, building to like O gauge is actually quite nice because, for example, if you want to look into custom decals or transfers, then you can use them.
Also, just the measurements are already there. It's one
Yeah.
less conversion. Instead of taking the original measurements, deciding on a scale, converting it to that scale, and then converting it into studs, you just have to take the measurements of an existing O gauge design and convert it into studs, which for me just sounds like the easiest way of doing it.
Yeah, that works pretty well. Jack, are you actually there?
Yeah, I think one of the things with 7 wide that tends to be an issue, which comes from the amount of jumpers and the amount of internal detail that you need to get it into 7 wide, is also they're incredibly heavy compared to, you probably get 8 wide trains that are probably lighter than 7 wide trains. So you need a lot of power to pull them as well. So I've got some trains 7 wide that effectively mean intercities have motors at either end, pushing and pulling at the same time.
The A3's got 2, I think the medium motors in the boiler and one underneath the tender, which pulls basically everything I've ever asked it to pull. But if you take one of those motors off, especially the tender motor, it will not pull anything.
All right, I think we've pretty much covered 7 wide, haven't we?
Okay, we'll move on. And we've also got an 8 wide fan here, which is Matt Dawson, our token US railroad builder.
Yes, so 8 wide or pen lug scale, depending on who you talk to, is roughly based on 15 inches to the stud. So that actually scales quite well if you do British 7 wide, because American trains are slightly wider. And it also meets like a standard of 10 foot is 8 studs. And a lot of American models are actually built to about a 10-foot width, so 8 foot, or 8 studs rather, scales down quite nicely for that. Obviously, as people have said, 8 wide is bigger, and in terms of American stuff, because that's obviously what I build, it is big, but what I would say is that having built copies of Will's Pullman coaches, my suburban coaches, which are 8 wide, roughly the same length, there's supposed to be about 65-foot coaches, are roughly the same weight. So even though mine are bigger, slightly longer, I believe, they're roughly the same weight. So there's actually no real, I'd have said, material difference in terms of weight, even though they're slightly wider, slightly taller, slightly longer. And again, I think that is because of what people have said in terms of that 7 wide needs jumpers and that sort of stuff, because obviously there is that weird sort of like half a stud of extra width either side you have to cope for.
Great, thanks, Matt. And finally, we've got, I'm sure Ian won't mind me calling him Weird and Wonderful. We have Weird and Wonderful narrow gauge, which runs on standard Lego gauge track, from Ian Scott.
Hello there, yes. Slightly different approach, really, to the scaling aspect, because with my trains, the scale aspect comes from the size of the figures, because they are scaled to work with the Belleville scale figures, which are much larger than a standard minifigure is. So it's working backwards almost from that. They generally seem to be about between 8 and 10 studs wide, and they do tend to look a little bit too tall, top heavy. But the beauty of narrow gauge is that the locomotives are actually still quite heavy in the real world, and a lot of the weight is down at the chassis level, with a lot of coal, things like that, not carried on the locomotive, carried separately, so the height doesn't really have an effect. Having built to fit onto the normal size Lego track, you kind of get a feel for other scales of building. None of the ones that I have now actually are powered, and they wouldn't work because of the wheels. They wouldn't go around corners because of the way that the track geometry is for Lego track. But they are, again, a different thing. They're more of a display model as a static model, so you can use a lot more sort of license, if you like. I tend to use a lot of older Lego train parts as opposed to using Technic parts, because again they're non-runners. They don't need to actually rotate the wheels and things like that.
Right, thanks, Ian. So I think we can open it up to the group as a discussion. And to start us off, perhaps we can ask a question which is already been covered a little bit, but what is the biggest challenge with your particular scale and how do you overcome that? And if we throw that back to Kaz, who started us off, we can maybe work through the different scales again in order.
Yes, thanks, Richard. With anything microscale, it really is the fact that you've got what is effectively quite large bricks to represent stuff. So, you know, a 1x1 plate with a couple of a clip on top of it, that can represent the whole pantograph of a vehicle. You can't get anything any smaller than that, though. So microscale really does rely on the suggestion of things rather than the accurate portrayal of it, I'm finding.
Yeah, and I think Isaac was saying that a little bit even in his 6-wide locos. There's a little bit more restraint in the design, and maybe you're not making a perfect replica. You're finding the identifying characteristics of a particular locomotive or wagon, and then trying to build something that suggests that particular feature is there, or that curve is there, or even that line of color.
Yes, exactly. And you find yourself sort of having to ask yourself what needs to stay and what needs to go. So, you know, do I want to put something on the front of for example, for a steam engine on the front of the boiler to show the I've forgotten what, the handle to open the front of the boiler. So
the smoke box start.
Yes, smoke box start. So I didn't do that for a while until they came out with the Lego piece, which was essentially a stud with a little bit of a bar next to it, and suddenly it looked just about right on a still quite big, but almost got away with in terms of style. And I think that's also one of the keys, is that there's a style to that you sort of have to. It's almost as a compromise. You can find a sort of style that will both look like what you're trying to portray and will also be something, I suppose, a sort of a unique looking model in itself.
I can agree with that. Isaac, can I ask you kind of an interesting question? When you're building your 6-wide engines, is it striving for realism, or is it striving to create, I guess, just the closest likeness? Because I feel like with how big the standard Lego wheels are, it almost comes across looking like a Hornby trying old school electric set.
Yeah, you know, I never thought about that actually. Yeah, especially before I put the trimline tape, which obviously isn't Lego, but if you can use a sticker, I reckon that kind of counts. Until I found the trimline tape, it certainly looked like it was more of a very basic, a toy almost, and I didn't mind that at all, because it was more or less what I wanted from the Loco. I actually used the size of the driving wheels almost as a reference, and then almost played it by eye from that point. So the driving wheels were, because the Lego standard driving wheels are a lot smaller, and you can get bigger ones. Obviously, if you want to build 7-wide, you can get bigger ones which are much better proportioned from third-party sellers like Big Ben Bricks. But when I started and I had the red train wheels and I wanted to build Mallard, I used that as a reference and then built out from there almost. And what I kind of realized is that proportionally, even though the train's a little smaller, it looks slightly better when working with those wheels once it's a little bit of much smaller build almost.
I think that's something important to mention, which you've just touched on, is when we're talking about the different scales, like 6-wide or 7-wide, that kind of defines how wide the Loco is. But when you start looking at how tall and long it is, quite often you actually start looking at more key components that define how big things are, like the driving wheels, and go from there instead.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, almost exactly.
based,
Yeah.
right?
What's interesting is that when I was building Mallard, I was working at the National Railway Museum, so I had almost the perfect reference. But what's quite funny is that I'm quite a tall chap, so when I'm stood next to Mallard, I come up to the top of the valances over the driving wheels, which is roughly what a minifigure comes up to when they are stood in front of my Lego version, which kind of, for me, worked. But obviously, it would then denote that every single Lego figure standing around it was 6'2", but also really chunky.
So I've started to steer away from the Lego minifig scale for that exact reason, because minifigs are a nonsense size. No human is that shape.
Yeah.
None of my coach. Well, I'm almost that shape, but none of the coaches I've built since my Mark 0.5s have even attempted to try and give a sensible representation of the interior, because that indicates that I want to put minifigs in it, and you can't. I mean, you can't. In order to build a coach whose interior would fit 4 minifigs sat side by side with a footpath in the middle, you'd need it to be about 20 wide, which would look patently ridiculous with minifigs sat in it.
I think it'd be quite funny if someone decided to make a train that was proportioned to a minifig, so just really short and chunky.
Yeah, to be fair, that's the exact opposite of the Lego City scale, but yeah, which is oddly tall and skinny. Particularly weird considering they use minifigs for it, but anyway. No, the thing you have to, no matter what scale you work in, you have to learn to sacrifice your darlings. It's very easy to get absolutely down a rabbit hole going, I must include this detail, I must include that. And I have to say, I learned quite a lot looking at Isaac's 6-wide stuff. Whilst I've got a lot more space to fit in mine for actual physical details, which basically the reason I prefer 7 is I can put more detail into it. The simple fact that all Isaac had to do to elevate his locos from nice representations with not a lot of detail to, frankly, a lot nicer looking than mine, was put some tape on it. And it's like, sometimes you have to go, well, I could spend 6 hours and millions of pounds on this detail that will be completely out of scale of everything else, or I could just go, no, I won't bother with that, but I will put some lining on, which will make it look a lot nicer anyway.
I think where I win is the fact that I'm not actually building anything real. I've just completely made it up out of my head, and therefore I can do what the hell I like, and nobody can say it's wrong. So I really do admire people that are actually trying to build real things and make them look decent in Lego, whatever scale they're using.
Well, it has to be said, with the exception of my Q and exception of my tender engines, all my designs had technically completely unreal locomotives, just because it gives you that flexibility. If you like, someone like myself who's spent his entire life growing up around railways, I know what a steam engine should look like. I know what it needs, so I tend not to worry too much about getting the exact locomotive, and more getting the feel of the locomotive, the feel of a type of locomotive. So my pug is nominally inspired by the Lancashire and Yorkshire pugs, but it's not a Lancashire and Yorkshire pug. It's got a completely different cab. It's got several features that are different. But I've looked at the layout and added bits that I know it would need, whilst not necessarily including every measurement, because that stuff drives you crazy.
Yeah, the flavour of something rather than the actual nitty of it.
Yeah,
I think that's the problem with mine is I try and make it so that the minifigures aren't massive compared to the actual height of the coach. I try and stick to 6 tall, but then the problem with that is I then don't do the length as long as it should be, so it almost looks, it's like squat almost.
That's a side effect of Lego City. Everybody's starting with Lego City. It seems to be a weird thing where everybody builds their coach pretty much in proportion with Lego City coaches, even though Lego City coaches are pure nonsense. So you get these people who spend years of their life building these amazing locomotives, and then they just cobble together some coaches based on the Emerald Knight coaches, and of course they don't fit in scale with anything. I did the exact same thing with my first attempt at the Pullmans. My first Pullmans were 6 wide, but they were too short. I couldn't even fit 2 toilets in them. Technically, they're still too short, but there comes a point where I haven't got that much money. Matt will back me up on that one.
I mean, deviating back, are there any specific accents or details on trains that you just have given up on trying to put on completely?
I'd say there's one particular feature of Steam Locos in particular that's almost impossible to get right, and that's the splashes. So that's the bit of the running board,
yeah.
which basically the wheels stick up through quite a thin metal plate, and just recreating that in Lego is a nightmare.
The fundamental problem with Lego Steam Locos is their wheels, in order to fit the Technic pins that allow you to do any of the running gear, have to be about a brick thick, which makes modelling anything where wheels go behind anything incredibly difficult unless you're an American with at least 8 wide, preferably 10 wide locos.
I
How
agree. Sorry, I had to do the Midland spinner in 6 wide. Basically next to impossible, so I ended up making the wheel 5 wide and just not touch the ground and like a specific a separate thing.
That's quite a nice way of doing it, I think.
Right, and you made the driving wheel flangeless, right? So you didn't have to worry about that extra lip.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it was attached to the back wheel, which had all the weight on it.
Right. That was the Carl Gray trick, right? Being able to slap the rubber bands on it.
Yeah, it was that exact trick because I saw that and thought, oh, he's a genius. I'm going to steal that.
Look,
You mean he actually used Lego for once?
I think that's a problem with that's another problem with Lego is the fact that to fit any wheels in, you have to put the running plates above the wheels. There's no specific parts where you can actually have it like in real life, where the wheels go actually through the frames with the splashes over them.
The trick I like to use, it's one I use with the Q. If you make the way I prefer to make footplates is they tend to be a bit thick, but they hide a multitude of sins. So with my Q, what I did was using the 2 on top, 4 on the side brackets. I effectively have my brackets, my footplate overhang the wheels slightly. So the fact that you've used slightly undersized wheels that don't hit splashes is harder to see because you've got a tile over the top of them hiding some of your sin. A lot of Lego, it's not so much about getting the details right as hiding the bits you've inherently got wrong.
If someone does an A4 that could totally, in 7 wide, that totally covers the driving wheels proportionally, please give me their number because I want to interview them.
I mean, there is a couple that are not bad. The problem I find is the people who get that bit right somehow can't help themselves but get something really obvious that everybody else got right horribly wrong. Well, that's part of the problem with building your own style. No matter what you do, somebody else will have done the right answer, but it breaks something you've already done.
Okay, let's loop back round to Ian Scott and his much wider locos. So do you have any trouble building the rods and pistons into locos, Ian, or do you not worry too much about specific prototypes when building?
I tend not to base the locos that I build on anything that's real. I look at a lot of pictures of narrow gauge locos and take a chimney from here and a cab side from there and a bit like that. With the running gear, because they don't actually have to run, if you build a very pretty looking locomotive, nobody really notices if the running gear doesn't actually do anything. There's some really nice old parts from the old trains. So some of the coupling rods are very thin and narrow, so they're not using the quite chunky Technic system of connecting up and up and up. And I tend to use just a single direct drive style operation on them anyway. So there's only really one thing going down as the coupling rod, and if there's anything else, it's just some bars that are clipped somewhere just to give the impression of that. Having the liberty of just being able to build, and in that scale where the running gear is still quite small based on the size of the Loco. The Loco is a lot bigger than the running gear because it is narrow gauge. You can get away with, as it was said, a multitude of sins by doing that.
Thanks, Ian. I think that's it as well. And there's less to go wrong if you're running those locos at shows as well. There's less to go wrong, and hopefully you can run a loco without any mishaps the entire show, which isn't something we usually do in LNUR. I don't think we've made it through an entire day or weekend without at least one crash.
Yeah, it's part of the fun.
Yeah, if it doesn't happen, what's the point?
Is that mostly due to William drifting stuff?
Hey, no, it's more likely due to Pete's backside.
This is true. Pete
Why
Pete
you
does have a reputation of
The
knocking
more
locomotives.
blame the person in the chat right now, so it's always Pete's fault.
I mean, that's not a massive deviation from reality.
Anyway, Matt wanted to make a comment about some Streamlined Locos, so back over to Matt.
Yeah, so one thing I was going to mention was that if you're doing a Streamlined Loco, now obviously talking about British stuff, that's going to be a bit more difficult because of the way British locos are designed and the fact we don't have much in the way of streamliners. An A4 with streamlining would probably not suit this method, but what you could do for, say, something like the LMS Streamlined Locos and certainly a lot of American ones is actually to use panels on their side, so you can actually sort of get around this wheel issue because your panels are actually that much thinner, and obviously then you can space them out so they actually go slightly to the side of the wheels, and then you resolve that issue about the wheels touching the sides. The only issue with that is that you're obviously stuck to trying to build snot in, and then obviously you've got the issue of you've got to build big enough for the snot to actually scale correctly with the rest of the loco. And the only other way you could do British locos using this method would possibly to use the, say, 1x4 panel inverted, but again you're using snot to get that technique, and obviously trying to build that into a 6 or 7 wide body is probably going to be very difficult.
Yeah, that's kind of dovetailing into what I was saying about the footplate as well. Using the brackets to miss out the wheels where you can. I mean, one thing you can also try and do is if you don't necessarily build the wheel arrangement, you build the wheel arrangement to look like the engine, but you don't necessarily build it to function like it. The way Andrew Harvey has with his, can't remember what was it, a Manor, wasn't it?
The Manor class, yeah.
Yeah. So by removing flanges you don't need, it not only runs better and causes the bogey not to foul everything, but it also gives you a bit more play because you've got less flanges in the way. Because obviously the real issue with splashes is not covering the wheel, it's covering the blasted flange, which is massively out of scale as well.
A compromise I make with quite a lot of my steam locos is just to have the driving wheels slightly smaller than what they actually should be for the true scale, and that just means you can get away with having the running board a bit higher and they just fit in.
Yeah.
It's the
Sometimes just
illusion, right?
a running board can still just about work as long as you proportion the rest of it accordingly.
And I mean, I don't think it takes away anything from the Loco as a whole.
If you do it right, it doesn't.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more bits we want to mention? Chris, you can do your cat scale in a minute. Jack, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No,
Maybe
not
about your... Okay. Chris, if you want to do your cat thing.
Okay, so cat scale, as we have missed out, is the scale that I use for the underground. And like a cat, if it fits, it sits.
I really want to boo that.
Boo! I did it for you.
Grown.
Okay, thanks everybody for their contribution to that discussion on scaling in LEGO Locomotives. I think we can move on to our wagon of the podcast. And we've got Chris Miller back again, and he's going to be talking about his Boots number 2 Loco. So when and where was this Loco built, Chris, and what was it used for?
It was built in 1935 by the Andrew Barclay in Scotland. It was built especially for the Boots Company. It was one of 2 locomotives they had, and it is a fireless locomotive.
Okay, and for those visitors or those listeners in who aren't in the UK, just explain a bit about Boots, what Boots is, because I think as UK citizens we probably all know what it is, but maybe it doesn't translate too well to America or other parts of Europe.
Boots is a pharmacy that you go to if you've got no sense and you want to spend more money than you would at any other pharmacy in Britain.
We'll await letters from their lawyers over this podcast. Okay.
Yeah, the reason it's a fireless loco is because it was based at their chemical works, and the slightest spark could cause quite a large explosion. So it was needed for that reason.
Okay, and what was your inspiration for building it? Presumably because it's a slightly weird loco, and that's kind of
Well, partially. First of all, I didn't want my street cred to go any lower than it currently is. So instead of
You
doing
have
a proper steam engine, I thought I'd do a cheat and do a fireless one.
fair enough. It's nice to have some weird prototypes to play with, anyway.
Yeah. The
So
second
how long
reason,
did it take you to build? Oh, sorry.
sorry,
Yeah,
the second reason I built it is because it's currently at the Midland Railway at Butterley. It was donated there in 1981, so I have seen it in the flesh.
Okay, good reasons. So how long did that take to build, and do you know roughly the number of parts in the model? It looks quite small from the photo I can see.
It's roughly, I haven't got it to hand at the moment, it's in the other unit. It's about 12 to 14 studs long. Part wise, there's not many at all. I'd probably guess about 70, perhaps 80.
Did it take long to design and build?
Designing, no. Probably a couple of hours because I pretty much just grinded at that, looking at the picture. Got it somewhere near what I liked. Had a bit of help from Matt. He helped me with the top of the boiler.
It's quite helpful like that sometimes,
Yeah,
as well as doing our podcast and loads of other jobs.
yeah, and editing all our muck-ups.
Our many mistakes.
Yep. So yeah, a couple of hours perhaps, with a gap in the middle when I needed a bit of help with that bit. And then I just ordered it on Bricklink, and I think it cost something ridiculous like £13.
Bargain.
I think the wheels cost more because I had to get them
'Cause it
from
was white.
Big Ben Bricks, whatever it's called.
It's rather nice that it's the right blue for Lego blue, isn't it?
Yeah,
Look-
it's spot on. The logo looks like it's the wrong blue, but it's actually like that on the real engine as well. They got the blue wrong on the logo.
And what were there any particularly challenging parts of the model? You said you asked Matt for some help.
Just the top bit of the boiler. Just so I didn't have a really ugly flat plate on top.
Fair enough.
Yeah, there's a couple of little pieces I may have chopped down, shall we say, to fit.
What if you were going to build any more another loco to go with it? Is there a boots number one, or is there some
There's
sort of wagons or rolling stock you could build that would match that?
rolling stock. I don't know. Trying to find info about this locomotive is very sparse. Apart from me telling you that it has a steam reservoir that holds 160 psi, I've practically told you everything I've found about it. Pictures wise, all the pictures I've found of number 2 are in the Midland Railway shed that it's currently stored in. And the number 1, which is on some railway down Somerset, is in a very rough condition, and that doesn't run.
Too much cider, presumably.
Yeah, I mean it's just a shell. Looking at it, to be honest, and there's no paint on it or anything.
Is this one operational then? Because I thought most railways wouldn't have the equipment required to feed it with steam.
It can run. It's just they don't have the way to make it run. Hook it up to a steam pipe. I assume that's the correct term for it. And in theory, it should run.
I tried Googling it to see if I could find some more photos for you, Chris, but I've just got loads of photos of boots with train wheels on
You
them.
have to type in Boots Loco number 2 to get anything, and there's about 5 pictures. There's more of Boots number 1, and that one's derelict.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. We'll move on to the wagon of the podcast now, which is Jack Horner, and he's going to be talking about his MGR or merry-go-round hopper wagons. Welcome, Jack.
Hello, Richard. You all right?
Yes, not bad. So, do you want to tell us about where your wagons were built and when and what they were for?
Yeah, so the merry-go-round hopper wagons, or the MGR hoppers as they're more commonly called, were actually used to transport coal from essentially mines, well, not mines, usually ships, to any power stations within the UK. And actually meant so they could be loaded on the top and effectively just dumped when through the bottom of the train when they actually reached the power station. The reason I built them was because, in fact, the town where I come from, a small town called Shildon, which is very famous for Lego shows these days.
Shildon has the highest per capita rate for Lego shows in the country, I think.
I think in the world, Richard, the world.
Possibly the world.
Yes, so before we had Lego shows and all that sort of jazz, we effectively used to build wagons, and we built wagons for hundreds of years. If anyone doesn't know, the very first passenger railway set off from Shildon, not Darlington. It was the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So we've always had a lot of history of trains in Shildon. But effectively, we didn't used to build a lot of trains, a lot of locomotives, or passenger vehicles. Effectively, we were very much a wagon works. So there was thousands of people employed at the Shildon Wagon Works, including a lot of my family as well.
How long did it take you to design and build? Because I know you're a builder who tends to design digitally first and then buy the parts and build the model. So how long did that take?
So something like this was actually the first sort of mock that I made train-wise, was the MGR hopper because of the connection to the town. So it would take me probably about a month. I do take an awful lot of time trying to get the details right in a locomotive.
Yeah, it does look really good as well. It was popular at shows when you first started bringing it along. Were there any particularly challenging parts of the model?
I think a couple of ones were to get the actual slopes. So the wagon's got a lot of intricate slopes on it that supposedly feed the coal down into the chutes. And to get those looking right, there's a bit of snot work ongoing there to try and get that perfected. So that took some time. But the other thing is there's a lot of red. If people have seen them, I know there's one at the National Railway Museum in Shildon. There's a lot of red sort of metal work around the chassis, and effectively that was at the two ends. It's a bit of a nightmare to get right because Lego don't do many sort of rods and parts in red that would fit nicely. So that took quite a while to do.
And I suspect you may have already built some, but what locomotive would you build to go with these wagons?
Funnily enough, I don't think I've really got one that would fit with these. I've obviously got, as everyone I think in LNUR has, I've got a Gronk that I've mocked, but I think something like a Class 56 or something would have been typically pulling these wagons, but I've never built one of those.
No, I'm not sure I've seen a Class 56 in Lego. Somebody must have designed one at least digitally by now.
Yeah. Well, it definitely needs one. Mind you, I need to build more than one, Richard, before
That's true. You need a
start
rate.
building a train with them.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. That was really interesting. It's a great wagon as well. So we'll put some photos of that into the podcast.
One question I have, as MGR trains were quite long, how many wagons has he got of this type?
I have one wagon of this type.
It's a very short...
I tend not to build rakes of them. I tend just to design one, get the look absolutely perfect, and then not bother building anymore. I just move on to the next wagon I'd like to design.
A short attention span, that's why.
There's your LNUR wagon for next year, then, eh?
Yep, quite possibly.
Definitely, William.
One feature just before we bring the podcast to a close is Chris's regular checkup on the Berlin Subway Lego Ideas project. So over to Chris for that one.
Great news, everyone. Berlin Subway has 61 supporters and 4 days left. Watch this space. It's going to claw its way back.
Anyway, moving on.
Get your VPNs out. We'll soon pretend to be 70,000 different people.
It's a yellow train, so it's totally up my street.
I've tried, it doesn't work.
As with all yellow trains, it's rubbish and nobody wants it.
And there we go.
Didn't we have a guest with Rocket on?
Yes. Oh, that is worth a mention. So the Rocket Ideas project by Steve Mays, aka Brick This, is up to, I think it's just under 1,000 votes now. So he's doing pretty well, because I think what total was he on when we interviewed him in the first podcast? It was
300 odd, I think.
About 300 and
It
something.
doesn't
So he's done
matter.
really well.
Because as William said, no one's interested in yellow trains.
I mean, that's sadly probably true.
Yes, I've been seeing it popping up quite a lot in various Lego fan Facebook groups and things. So,
But are we taking all the credit for the publicity that we gave it then, Richard?
yeah,
it's,
we'll be
it's
taking
on
it down.
993 at the moment, with 369 days left.
Yeah, it's got quite a decent length of time to go, and it seems to be progressing reasonably well.
Do
so
they not increase the
I think
number of days at 1,000 as well?
Yeah, I think you might get some extra time once it reaches 1,000 votes, and Steve is pretty close to that. So
Yeah,
make sure to
7
put
more
a link
people.
on the description as usual for that. So thanks for listening if you've made it this far in the LNUR line. And thanks to our special guests, Kaz, aka Blockhead UK, and Ian Scott, too, from Northern Brickworks, for joining us on this podcast. Our next episodes are going to be on the Brick Train Awards. We're going to be talking about the results and having a look at some of the winners' models, which have taken our eye, and also discussing the winners of the LNUR award in that. So we'll be picking, as LNUR members, 2 of our favourite entries from the awards, and thanks to TechBrick, the UK distributor of Trick Bricks and S-Brick, we're able to award a £60 first prize and £40 second prize voucher to use on their website. Our next podcast after that will be all about standardization on LEGO railways, including the L-gauge modular standard, the Mills system for landscaping, and a couple of the LNUR standards for loading gauge and things like that. So join us then. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Toodaloo.
Hello.